The night smelled like gasoline and rain when Rook saw the blood first, thin, bright against the gravel like a promise undone. He kicked his bike to a stop, and the engine coughed, stalled in the silence. A brass casing shimmered in the pool of light from the lone street lamp. Nell's shoe prints led away from the splatter, away from the bike, away from where a man ought to have been dying if the trap had been meant for him. He felt something loosen in his chest that he couldn't name, a weight that wasn't fear, not wholly. It was the sharp knowledge that someone had laid a price on the thing he'd sworn to keep sacred, and the bait had been the one person who had never been merely property of the patch. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He shouldn't have followed her. That was the first rule, the one he used when dealing with prospects who wanted to be ghosts, or with wives who wanted to burn the charter for peace. But rules were lines that flexed when the thing they protected had a throat. Nell had been late to the chapter house for weeks. Ledger entries had gone missing like people slipping through alleys, and the number next to one of those entries hummed under his teeth like a gun to be fired. He'd watched her in the kitchen, watched the way she kept her hands moving when she talked, the way her smile would tighten at the edges when he came near. He had watched because he needed to know what she carried in the quiet of the office. Invoices, letters from a mother he had not forgiven, names scratched into margins like prayers. Tonight had been supposed to be a question. Instead, it was a knife. She stood 3 yards down the road, coat bunched in her hands, shoulders hunched against the rain that had started without warning. Her hair was tucked into the collar, dark and obedient. She turned when he cleared his throat, and he saw the map of her face. Small, hard lines around the mouth, eyes that refused to be small. For a moment, he thought she might laugh. One of those small, private laughs she reserved for the ledger when she corrected a sum. But when their gazes met, the laugh died like a light snuffed. Her hands dropped away from the scrap of paper she'd been holding. There was something on the page that made her mouth go still, a crease of worry in her forehead that had nothing to do with numbers. "Rook," she said, voice low. It wasn't a greeting. It was a naming, an invocation. He moved closer because his body had its own momentum for her, the same slow draw that a bike had to the road. Up close, he could smell cedar and something else, metallic under the wet. The broken brass lay at his boot like a totem. He crouched without asking, fingers skilled from years of checking pockets and roots, lifting it as if it might tell him a confession. The sigil etched into the casing was a neat, ugly thing. Dario Cruz's mark, a crossed dagger over a crown. Rook's jaw tightened. The name was a rusted key in the lock of his memory. Dario had a laugh like a split reed and a temper the size of the river. He'd been pushing into their edges for months, moving men, whispering promises like poison. "Why were you out here, Nell?" His voice was not the president's roar. It was quieter, a blunt instrument wrapped in silk. She was so small in the light, hands folded because she did not know where to put them. "I went to make sure the courier got the pickup right." She said it like she had rehearsed the lie. Rook could feel the syllables as if they were bruises. "There was a messed up tally. I wanted to fix it before—" Before what? Before someone noticed? Before the club thought the books were clean? His mouth tasted of old tobacco and the memory of a woman who used to sew patches on new vests while Rook told legends by the hearth. He remembered her in the chapter house, a ghost among the men, small and efficient and always 2 steps from being seen as less. He also remembered the way she straightened his collar once, fingers deft with the steel of buttons. And the warmth of that moment had become a thing he could not easily reconcile with authority. "I found casings," he said. "Someone tried to make this look like an execution." Her eyes flicked to the puddle of oil, black and slick where someone had slashed at his bike's tank to stall him. For a second, the street shrunk into them, the rain a curtain between what was true and what was not. "It wasn't you they wanted," she said, with the small cruelty of truth. "They wanted to make sure the club felt it." Rook imagined the conversation that had happened without him. Dario on the other end, voice like a betting man offering a price. He imagined Nell meeting that voice, folding a life into clauses. The thought that she could be bait for him felt like a fresh wound. He had been president for 5 years, and the club had made him into something less soft around the edges. Men expected him to have answers. He had them, but not for the way his chest hurt when she looked like she had been someone else's ledger. He remembered, too, the look in Dario Cruz's eyes the last time they'd met at the neutral diner. Hungry, bored, like a man measuring a row of pockets to see which one would hold up under his hand. Dario had not taken because he could. He took because it made men scramble for their teeth. "Why would you go alone?" Rook asked. That wasn't a reprimand dressed in leather. It was the president trying to parse the small, dangerous choices of a woman who had always been small. Nell's hands curled around the paper until her knuckles shone white. "Because someone had to," she said. "Because when Jason—" She swallowed. "Because when they took him, the numbers shifted. Dario wanted proof we were broken. He wanted us looking at the books and not at our own throats." Jason. The name landed in Rook's mouth like a stone. Nell's brother. He felt the layout of everything tilt on that axis. He had seen Jason at the chapter once, a kid with hands too big and eyes too soft, trying to learn how to tighten a chain. Nobody had asked how he had come into Dario's reach. Nobody had pried until now. Rook could feel the ledger between them like a thin shield. "You should have told me," he said, though he wasn't sure if he meant the club, Dario, or the ache in his gut that had nothing to do with code and everything to do with the way Nell's hair fell when she bent over the desk. "I did tell you," her voice fractured. "Not in words. I told you in the books. I told you in the checks." Her hands moved, suddenly alive, the way she'd been alive stitching through a torn vest. Quick, precise. "I moved money where it would be noticed. I gave small things to people who owed favors. I'm not your betrayal, Rook." His fingers tightened on the casing. The metal bit into his palm. He wanted to be furious. He wanted to march back to the chapter house and call a meeting and have men in patched vests line the room and scream for Dario's blood until someone offered it. The club would demand retribution. The code, engraved deeper than law in these places, would demand it. A redress of balance, a measure paid in pain. But there was another measurement now, one that had nothing to do with fingers finding triggers and everything to do with the way his heart learned to soften like old leather under hands that knew how to mend. If she had traded pieces of the club's safety for her brother's life, it was an act of a different sort of courage, one that might save a life at the cost of their sanctified ledger. That put Rook where he refused to sit, between the book and the woman who had kept it for him. "Why didn't you say anything to me about Jason?" His question hung. Thunder had started somewhere distant, and the rain was steady now, washing the street into a smear. She looked away, jaw working. "Because telling you would have been bargaining in public," she said. "Because going to Dario was bargaining in private. Because I thought I could fix it without making you the sacrificial thing you hate being made into. Because I thought," her breath hitched, "because I thought I could buy him back." Buy him back. The words were a transaction dressed in a prayer. Rook felt the word buy like a bill passed across a table, both parties knowing the cost and neither trusting the change. He could see the calculus in her eyes. Sleepless nights, whispered negotiations, the slow giving away of the club's margins until they had nothing left. He had been so busy holding the club up like an altar that he had not looked to see who had been pressing offerings into it. A motorcycle engine spat like a single note in a dirge as a black vest passed in the distance, the silhouette of a prospect on carbon fiber. The world was a weaving of codes and danger and small mercies. If Nell had chosen, recklessly, agonizingly, to trade safety for family, she had flouted the code the way a woman chooses her child over doctrine. That would mean trouble. It also meant she had been protecting something he had been grown to protect too late. He could call the chapter and demand that they deal with Dario with the fury of men who had everything to prove. He could take the ledger from her hands and add up where she had paid and where she had lied and make sure the punishment fit the crime. Or he could ask a different question, one that would eat at the easy righteousness of the club but might save the small, vital things he had learned to hold dear. The dilemma sat between them like an unmade bed, each of them unwilling to be the one to pull back the sheet and see the stain. Behind them, at the edge of the street, a door slammed, and somewhere a dog barked as if to punctuate the night. The city breathed in and out. Rook felt the club pressing at his shoulders like a mantle. It warmed him, but it also weighed him down. He had been careful to be the president who was iron and not tenderness. Now, tenderness knocked like a person outside his door, asking to be let in. Where were you meeting them? He didn't ask for a name. He didn't yet want to call Dario's bluff. He asked for a place, a time, anything that would give the man who wore the patch something to chew on. Nell's lips moved in the light like someone counting. An old warehouse off 3rd, dockside, she swallowed. Midnight. He wanted proof I'd be there. He wanted to make sure the bait was live. Rook's muscles coiled because this was the part of the road he understood, the geography of threats. He could map the place in his head the way he mapped a choke point on a run. The warehouse was a thin, dangerous place where the river came close and the cameras were sparse. Dario chose it because he knew men liked the feel of water near their sins. Rook thought of the brass casing in his hand, the oil slick, the blood that might have been his. He thought of the ledger tucked in his mind and the place where Nell's name had been written like a stanza. He had to choose. The club would expect him to move like a storm. Nell, small and sharp, had already moved like a gambler with dirt on her palms. Between the roar of engines and the silence in her eyes, a tide was building. He had been president long enough to know that tides took lives and made saints out of grief. He had also been a man who learned to measure the space between authority and mercy. "Tomorrow," he said finally, the word an iron hinge easing on a door. "We go together." He heard the hesitation in her inhale and the little, private surrender in the way her shoulders drooped. "Together," she echoed, not as a relief, but as a lit fuse. She folded the scrap of paper into the pocket of her coat, fingers lingering as if the paper were a thing that could be stitched back whole. They rode back to the chapter house in a silence that tasted like anticipation. Rain laid ribbons across the highway, neon smeared into the slick, and Rook felt the bike hum beneath him like a caged animal. He kept his hand on the small of Nell's back without thinking. It was an old reflex from when he would guide prospects through their first cold rides, when a touch could steady a man on the edge of his new life. Tonight, the touch steadied something less official and more dangerous: his own tendency to decide for others. He had been a man who solved problems with iron. With Nell, he felt the machinery of himself loosen into something that could rust. That terrified him more than Dario's knives. In the chapter house, the men were already gathered, the air heavy with coffee and cigarette smoke, faces like maps of past fights. Prospects flitted at the edges, eager to stand near heat. Rook felt their attention like a slow pressure against his back. They were waiting for the sign that he was still the axis. He walked through them with Nell at his hip, the ledgerless silence between them a new coat of paint on old plaster. "You rode together?" Cade, his sergeant at arms, asked without warmth. Cade had been Rook's shadow in every fight and every mistake. Loyalty to him was a thing measured in scars long enough to be landmarks. Rook didn't answer, the way the men wanted. He didn't unfurl his authority like a blade. He merely said, "Yes." The single word settled like a coin on the table. Cade's jaw tightened. "We go after Dario at dawn," Rook added, "but we do it our way." There were murmurs. Men did not enjoy the word "our" applied to a woman whose patch had always been iron and ledger. Nell's presence near the hearth where the men ate felt like a thing unaccounted for in their bones. She kept her head low, hands clasped because she didn't want to be the subject of anyone's gaze. Rook saw that submission undercut her, and something like fury rose in him. The club had forged men who could not hold the complexities of women who were not accessories. He held that fury down like a tide. As they planned, Nell stood at the edge of the map table, with fingers that trembled just enough to make the pen feel heavy. She'd been through worse nights than this, and yet the ledger in her mind, the rubrics and balances of loyalty, was out of order. "If we go in with a full patch," she said, voice small but steady, "Dario will know it's a setup. He'll pull back, or he'll kill the thing he's using as leverage." Cade laughed, abrupt. "We are not here to be led by her fears." Rook's head turned slowly. "She isn't our fear," he said. He set his palm flat on the map. The table caught the vibration of a man trying to hold two truths: the club's demand for retribution, and a quieter calculus that had nothing to do with show. "We go with a skeleton crew. Quiet. 2 bikes in, 2 out. We make it look like a pickup gone wrong and not a siege." The men argued. They argued in the language they had been given at birth. Codes written in leather. Tests measured by who could carry the most pain without flinching. Some wanted to burn Dockside entirely. Some wanted to leave a message. Rook let them argue because the best men needed to believe their voices mattered. But when the noise rose high enough that it drowned the map, he cut through it with the blunt instrument of command. "We ride at dawn. We take only what we need. We come back with Jason." That last clause caught like an ember. Silence contracted. Men glanced at Nell as if she were now a mirror reflecting something they had been refusing to see. Some of them had known Jason as a kid. Some had thrown him a nod in the yard. None had known he could be bought and bartered like a pocket watch. To Rook, Jason's face was a dissonant chord. A kid who had liked to tinker with radios, who laughed too loud, whose hands still had baby scrapes under the knuckles. The thought of him tied or broken under Dario's thumb made the club into a furnace where someone else's blood might be melted and remade into righteous fury. "You sure?" Cade asked when the men had been told to prepare. His voice had the edge of a man who had been a boy when the rules had first been decided. Rook looked at Nell. Her jaw held, the set of someone who had been carrying a weight her whole life. "I'm sure," he said. He had a plan in his head, and somewhere in the plan was a room that would not be filled with lawless anger. That room had Nell's name written on it in small, precise letters. They split into teams at 3 in the morning. Fog lay low over the river like something mourning an old life. Nell rode with Rook, and the cold this time was a thing they shared like a secret. "You could have told me sooner," he said, not as blame, but because he needed the confession out of her like a map pulled from a pocket. She kicked at the footpeg, breath steaming in the air. "I thought I could do it alone." He wanted to thrust his hands into the places of her fear and drag everything out. A confession, a bargain, an apology, and set it on the table like a clear debt. But he also knew the hazards of ownership. A man who kept tally of another's sins could make a ledger of love and never realize the cost. "You can't play both sides and expect neither of us to fall," he said. Her laugh was humorless. "I wasn't playing sides. I was trying to buy Jason back. You have to understand, his debts were not only to Dario. He got involved with the wrong crowd. I thought if I could pay what he owed, if I could make him disappear from that life. You thought you'd disappear too, he finished, because he could see the arithmetic. She had given up parts of the club, small diversions in accounting, favors, to make the trade. It was not surrender. It was a sacrifice that cut a different way. They arrived at dockside with dawn like a pale witness. The warehouse loomed, glass-balled windows like eyes that had stopped crying. The smell of the river mixed with oil and old money. Nell's fingers had folded into silent fists at her sides. Rook felt the club's expectations like a cloak that needed airing. Some of the men wanted to run hot, make an example of Dario. Others were quieter, young, and scared of a man who could be reckless with their lives. Rook held them on a leash. They moved like shadows. The plan was tight as a drumhead. 2 bikes at the perimeter, 2 entering under cover of the opposite wall, a small squad ready to spring. Rook felt the map in his bones, the back door by the loading bay, the rusted staircase that returned to the alley. If Dario had chosen this place, he had chosen it for fewer witnesses and more excuses. When they breached the warehouse, the air inside was a kept breath. Crates were stacked like coffins. In the center, there was a small pool of light where 2 men in a navy blue vest stood with their arms crossed, eyes like tiny knives. Rook measured them quickly. They were not Dario's top dogs. Men like that tended to carry their violence as an announced thing. These men were details, placeholders. That should have been a mercy. "Rook," a voice said from the back. Dario emerged, the grin like a blade polished tenderly. He was more handsome than Rook remembered, thin in a way that made his malice look more refined, like a sculpture that could cut. "You brought a woman to bargain club honor." Nell's spine was straight. She had been taught to make herself small, and she had learned to unmake that lesson in the dark. "Where's Jason?" she asked. Dario's smile widened. "You were always the best at keeping books, Nell. Shame you never learned how to balance them for your own debt." He held up a phone like a trophy. On the screen was a video of a man whose face was blurred by shadow and pain. The voice that followed was a woman's, sobbing. "I have what you want. You know the price." Rook felt his men shift like animals sensing a storm. The rulebook in his pocket hummed the pages of retribution. Cade stepped forward, muscles coiled for the kind of violence they understood. Rook filled up a hand. He did not want to be the man they expected, all teeth and no mercy. He wanted to be the man who understood that sometimes the only way to keep a family is to make room for its messy heart. "Let him go, Dario," Rook said. "You take the safe, you take whatever you need. Jason walks." Dario laughed like a coin thrown into a well. "Now that's amusing. You come with your threats and your tenderness? Why should I trust either?" Nell stepped forward then, her voice a thread of defiance. "Because you know what I will do if you don't." Rook wanted to ask what she meant. Instead, he saw movement. A small, nearly imperceptible nod between Nell and a crate stacked at the back. In the beat between planning and action, he realized she had made preparations he had not been privy to. Her fingers had found the dark places men kept when they couldn't buy freedom. She had built an edge where he expected none. "We do it my way," Rook said, and this time it wasn't simply a command, it was an offering. He would not let the club be a theater for blood when the curtain could be cut with cunning. He would not be the man who let his need for vengeance erase the person who had been brave enough to risk everything for a brother. They moved like a single organism, men and plan and leather. Nell's shadow brushed past a crate, and Rook saw the glint of a knife slide into the darkness. It was enough distraction. Cade lunged, the men in the warehouse reacting with the neat choreography of trained violence. A shot cracked. The world narrowed and stretched and then bent. Someone fell. Dust bloomed like smoke from an old wound. Nell's hand was steady, and not for the first time, Rook marveled at how small things could carry a weight meant for larger hands. When the room stilled, Dario lay with a surprised bruise across his temple and a noose of humiliation tightening on his face. Jason's figure was dragged from a back room, blinking like a man who had been taught to sleep with one eye open. He was smaller than Rook remembered, hollowed, an outline of what had been bought and paid for. Rook's first thought was not the boy's deaths, it was that he was alive. He knelt beside Jason, fingers finding a pulse that was stubborn and wrong in the most beautiful way. Nell stood beside him, breath steaming. Her eyes were wet, not from her victory, but from the cost. "I thought I could do it without you," she said, voice low enough for only him. "I didn't want to drag the club into my mess." Rook's hand found her wrist, calloused and small. "You did what you had to," he said. The words were not absolution. They were a bridge. He felt the pull of the club at his back like a hungry animal ready to feast on an example. He also felt, sharper and stranger, the tug of something he could build with patient fury and cautious affection. When they left dockside, the river was a black seam in the morning. The men were quieter than when they'd arrived. Violence tends to hollow out words. Cade rode beside him, I saying what the men in the chapter would say soon enough, that Rook had made a choice that might cost him the thin rope of unquestioned authority they'd learned to trust. "Was that your call?" Cade asked when they were clear of the city, voice stripped of accusation and turned toward the rawness of truth. Rook thought of Nell's hands, the ledger of small sacrifices she had made. He thought of Jason's bruised jaw and the way a brother's life could become the furniture in a house of cards. He understood, with a clarity that made the world small and bright, that his stewardship of the club could not be only iron and ledger. It had to be a room big enough to hold mess and mercy both.
"It was mine," he said. "We do what keeps our family whole." Cade snorted softly, a sound halfway between a laugh and a warning. "Family has its price, Rook. Make sure it's not yours alone." Rook watched the road ribbon away beneath their wheels, wet and reflective, and felt the future like a thing both promised and owed. Nell's head rested against his shoulder in a small, reluctant show of trust. He didn't turn to look at her because he didn't need to. He knew her silence had been a bargain. He knew, too, that the bargain had been born in love, however ragged. For a long moment they rode like that, two people against the wind, the club behind them, the city opening up like a wound. The push and pull of the night had pulled them into a place where choices were not clean and people were not wholly right or wrong. The road ahead would have more traps, more men like Dario waiting to balance their greed against someone else's fear. But Rook realized he was no longer willing to be only the muscle of honor. Tonight had shown him the shape of a different kind of strength. And in the dark between two breaths, he let himself imagine what might be rebuilt if he and Nell learned to count each other in. As they crested the last rise before the chapter house, Nell turned her face to him. Wet hair clung to her cheek like a child's hand. The edge in her eyes had softened into something like relief and something else, maybe hope. "When this is over," she said softly, "we fix the books. We make sure nothing like this can happen again." Rook's mouth curved in a smile that was more a raw promise than anything he'd offered the club before. "We fix them together," he said. They descended into the light of the chapter house, engines a low hum, men waiting like a litany. Rook knew that the night would give rise to questions, to old men sharpening their knives on new grudges. But the pull had shifted. Where once he would have chosen spectacle and sanctioned wrath, he had chosen rescue and quieter justice. The club could rage. The world could demand hard answers. The thing he was securing now, the small, human thing Nell had almost traded away, was worth any price. Inside, the heat of the hearth welcomed them like a benediction. Nell moved to the office with a steady step. a woman who had carried a burden and now passed it into the light. Rook watched her go and felt the night's work settling under his skin like a new tattoo. Painful, permanent, and strangely tender. He did not yet know how the chapter would choose to interpret his mercy, nor did he know if Dario would be content with his bruises. But he knew this: the road ahead would be dangerous, and he would not ride it alone. They brought Jason inside like a child rescued from a well, ragged, blinking, as if he'd been taught to expect the world to end and then be surprised when it didn't. The chapter house took him in with the same clumsy tenderness they offered any broken thing. Blankets folded by calloused hands, coffee poured too strong, a chorus of questions that he couldn't answer because he didn't yet know how to speak without trembling. Men hovered, giving space with the awkward choreography of brothers who knew how to bail a man out of jail but not how to mend the quiet inside his chest. The hearth made a womb of heat, throwing its light in broad strokes across faces that had been carved by wind and time. Rook watched them from the doorway of the office as Nell sat with Jason, elbows on her knees, fingers worrying the hem of a blanket the way she used to worry the binding of a ledger. Up close, the boy was a map of neglect and survival, a thinness that wasn't only hunger, a bruise on the jaw, and eyes that had seen too many men decide the price of a life. "Get him something warm," Cade said, a statement more than an order. He stood near Rook like a monument. His face was a hard thing that rarely softened. Tonight it held a question like a stone in his throat. "We patch wounds. We don't let people pay for their family with the club's patience." There was a murmur of agreement rising, the kind of noise that could be comfort or condemnation depending on which way the wind tilted. Men wanted to believe they'd done something right. They wanted a simple ledger entry: rescue in, revenge out. But Rook knew the world didn't bend to arithmetic. It bent to human trouble, to choices made in the dark. Nell caught his eye, and there was a flicker. No triumph, no apology, only the raw residue of decisions that had cost her sleep. He stepped into the office and closed the door, the sound of it a small, private bell. She didn't flinch. She'd been waiting for whatever came next, like a woman used to taking blows and cataloging them. "You didn't tell me everything," he said. Not a reprimand, but an invitation and a demand both. She drew a breath the way people do when they're about to name the thing that has been eating them. "I told you enough to keep him alive," she said. "Everything else?" She lifted her hands and let the rainwater drip from her cuffs. "I didn't want to make you the center of my mess." Rook folded his arms, the president's posture by instinct and habit. "You made the club part of the mess whether you wanted to or not, Nell. You moved money. You bought favors. You answered to Dario. That's not just a personal sin. It's a risk to all of us." The words landed in the room like a verdict, simple and unrelenting. She closed her eyes, and when they opened again, they showed the hollow where something had been hollowed out. "It wasn't just money," she said. "It was names. I told him things, little things at first, men who owed small favors, routes that weren't supposed to be known. He used them to test us. Then he asked for more. He asked for Jason." The confession was a slow, terrible thing. Rook felt it in his chest like a bruise forming. Names. Those were the things a secretary guarded as fiercely as any man guarded a gun. Names could lead to men being watched, men being taken, pockets being picked. She had given away pieces of them. "How long?" he asked. 6 months, she said. The time rolled out and made the air thin. He started small. He paid a debt, then another. He made sure it looked like favors. I thought I could keep it all inside like a stitch. I told myself it would stop. He called last month and said if I couldn't produce enough, he'd take Jason to teach me to be honest. I didn't know what else to do. Rook felt something crack behind his ribs. It wasn't just the club's ledger she had altered.
It was the private contract between them, the invisible thing he had never thought to write down. He'd assumed her steadfastness the way men assumed the road would always lead home. The shock of her confession flattened him into a man suddenly without billets and bearings. "You lied to me," he said, not betraying the club so much as the intimacy they'd never named. "You put us at risk." "I lied to save my brother's life," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. "I'm not saying I did the right thing, Rook. I'm saying I was terrified, and I did the only thing I thought I could. I chose family over Ledger because someone had to. The club's rules do not account well for choices made by whims in the face of impossible cruelty. The oath to Patch and brotherhood can twist into a demand for spectacle when confronted with nuance. Word leaked like wind through rotten shutters. By noon, the chapter house felt smaller. The men gathered in knots with voices lowered and eyes sharp, weapons of gossip and suspicion out and honed on the truth they wanted: betrayal. Cade came to the office with footsteps that had the sound of a man carrying grievance. He'd been all muscle and loyalty for years. Tonight, his loyalty felt like a ledger turned to a fine print he hadn't wanted to read. "You're telling me you didn't run anything through the books without consulting the board?" he asked, blunt as a hammer. "I didn't consult because I had to keep Jason from being killed," she said. "I told you. I told the president. The rest." Her voice caught. "I couldn't risk Dario knowing we'd know. He'd make it worse." Cade's face settled into a kind of sorrowful geometry. "You understand how this looks to some of the men. They see numbers moved, and they see a woman with access. They see weakness, and they want to take advantage. You were playing with the fire under the club's table." Nell's fingers twined until knuckles showed white. "I know how it looks. I also know what it's like to be on the end of a man's appetite. I won't let my brother die to keep the club pristine." The day splintered into a dozen little fractures. Some of the men argued for expulsion. No mercy for someone who might have given intelligence to Dario, even under duress. Others argued for measured response. We had rescued Jason. End of story.
Rook stood in the center like an axis about to be bent. "You put us in danger," one of the prospects spat, red-faced and trembling with the righteousness of youth. "What if he'd wanted to take more? What if he'd set us up? Where were you when he came for us?" There was a chorus of assent, men sounding like a choir trained to the song of vengeance. Nell took their words into her like punches and did not flinch. That steadied Rook in a way that made him ache. He had expected the club to be a shield. He had not expected it to be a blade. "Enough!" His voice cut through the room, and the men went silent because it was his to wield. She kept Jason alive. She paid a debt no one here would admit had a price different than blood. We decide what to do as a club, not as a lynch mob. Cade's jaw worked. The room's anger simmered against the smooth of his command. "So what then?" he asked. "We let her stay?" "I won't punish a woman who risked her life to save a kid," Rook said. "But this doesn't go away. We audit. We make the books clean. We cut the avenues that made this possible. And we watch hard." Men nodded, some of them reluctantly. The compromise pleased no one fully. It was the kind of decision that would show up later at the edge of a knife, grievances kept in the rib like a splinter. But not everyone bought the compromise. There were small retributions, cold shoulders, whispers behind hands, invitations rescinded. The chapter house shifted like tectonic plates. Rook could feel the slow movement under his feet as alliances formed and fault lines deepened. Cade's quiet discontent was the most dangerous of all. He did not rebel openly, but loyalty withheld is a blade capped in the chest. That night, Nell found a note tucked under the ledger. No signature, just 2 words scrawled in a hand that ought to have been familiar by now, and yet wasn't gentle. Watch your back. She brought it to Rook like a child bringing a splinter. He read it and understood in a way men do not always like. The club had teeth, and they were raw. The message was not only a threat from Dario or his men. It was a promise from men within who had been affronted by mercy. He could have ordered a purge, make an example and close the wound by tearing the scab off. He could have shown the men that mercy would be punished. But he had seen the hollow Jason wore like a shame, and remembered his own mother's letters lying among the office's files, words he'd avoided because they asked for more than he had given. Power used without care becomes a wound to be nursed into a myth of itself. So Rook made a different move. He called the men to the yard, not for a show of force, but for work. They would clean the shop. They would fix bikes. They would reopen the accounts with every man present. He made restitution a ritual of labor and humility. Some saw it as weakness. Some saw it as a step toward healing. Nell joined him at the benches, sleeves rolled, the woman who'd been accused of barter now elbow-deep in grease beside the men who had wanted her gone. That night, after the men were gone and the chapter house settled into a suspicious sleep, Rook and Nell sat on the porch and watched the river swallow the moon. The quiet between them was not the old, comfortable silence of the hearth. It was sharpened by things said and not said. "You could leave," Rook said at last. The words were terrible in their simplicity. There was the option every man with power has and rarely uses: release. Let her go and perhaps save her from the club's future cruelties. Nell smiled, bitter, honest. Leave where? To who? To what? I tried that once. She held up her hands the way someone shows an open wound. I belong here, in ways I don't deserve and ways I do. I don't want the club's blood to be on my hands, Rook, but I also don't want Jason to be alone because I feared the consequences. He reached and took her hand. It was small and warm, like a bird's wing. "We can repair," he said. "We will. But you have to let us see the ledger. No more secrets." She inhaled, a soft thing. "I opened the ledger to you tonight. I will open it to the men. I will show them everything. I will take whatever falls from that." Rook's chest tightened. That kind of confession could either build a bridge of trust or burn the land between them to ash. He had to decide, in that silent black, whether his authority would be used to crush or to hold. "Then we begin," he said, "tomorrow." They sat until the cold made the skin shine on their knuckles, and the chapter house turned all its men to quiet breaths. The fracture lines left in the house would not vanish overnight. There would be men who left to join other colors. There would be whispers from Dario's camp that found new ears. Some nights would be filled with what-ifs and knives. But in the cold dawn, with the ledger open and the men around the table, Rook felt something like resolve settle into him. He had not chosen the easy path. He had not chosen a purity of wrath that would make the men feel righteous. He had chosen the harder thing, to keep the family whole on a foundation that could take both love and fault. Outside, across the river, the city polished its teeth. Somewhere a bike started up, and the sound stretched long, like a promise and a threat. Rook watched it go, and thought of Dario's bruised pride and the courier who had once counted money with a shaking hand. He thought of the ledger, of the names that must be protected, and of the woman beside him who had traded pieces of the club for a brother's life. The fractures were there. They cut. They would take work to mend. But wounds, Rook had learned, could become maps. If tended with care, they could show the way back to something larger than themselves. Outside, across the river, the city polished its teeth. Somewhere a bike started up, and the sound stretched long, like a promise and a threat. He leaned over the ledger and, with Nell at his side, began the slow, honest work of recounting every line that had been altered, every favor bought, every debt repaid. Outside, the world kept moving. Men moved through it like musk-scented storms, dangerous and tender in the same breath. And when the chapter house doors opened to the light, some men stepped in with questions, others with grudges. Rook met them all like a man carrying a weight that had grown where mercy and power had been braided together. He did not know whether that braid would hold when the next storm came, but he knew this. He would braid it with his own hands, and he would not leave Nell to walk a road she had already paved with the blood of what she loved. They expected spectacle. They got something quieter and somehow ferocious. Dawn was a bruise of purple when the first truck rolled up outside the chapter house. Two men in Dario's colors, faces masked by scarves. Kadaz's hand rested on his holster like a metronome. The men pressed close to doors and benches, the chapter house a hive that knew how to pull its sting together. Rook had told them what he would: repair the ledger and then ride out to close the soft wounds. He'd given them a plan that walked the thin line between spectacle and strategy. What he had not told them, what had enraged, terrified, and steadied him, was the peace he intended to burn for the sake of the woman who had traded numbers for a brother. He found Nell in the office, sleeves rolled, ink under her nails. She looked up when he opened the door, and the light on her face made her a small thing carved out of bone and courage. She'd slept poorly, like a person who has learned to stand while the rest of the world breathes. "They'll come," she said, not a question. "We know how to meet them," he replied. He could feel the club's pulse in his throat. He could feel Kadaz's eyes on the ridge of his shoulder, a weight of expectation. Rook moved to her and took her hand, a public tether no one could misread. "If they want to make you a lesson, they'll have to take me first." The words fell between them and were heavier than leather. She tried to pull her hand away, reflexive. She'd been taught not to be claimed. This time she didn't, and the surrender in that small, continued touch was a kind of answer that did not need words. They stepped into the yard together when the truck doors opened. Men spilled out like loose ash, and from the shadows, Dario walked, dressed in the contempt of a man who believes himself owed. He had his favorites with him, slick-faced men who smelled of other cities. He walked to the center of the yard, the sun cutting him into angles. "Rook," he said, as if the name were a fortune not paid. "You didn't expect us to be stupid enough to let you take what you wanted and get away with it," Rook answered, his voice calm, like a man who had decided he'd rather die holding something than live with it missing. He let his hand curl around Nell's fingers. It shocked the men, this small, deliberate defiance. It made the yard quiet in a way threats never could. Dario laughed, soft and slow. "You brought her out to bleed for your sins. Noble." "She's not my sin," Rook said. "She's my family." The word landed and did what he had intended. Split the men into those who would see loyalty as a weapon and those who would see it as a crime. "You're taking men and calling it business. We call it what it is." Dario's men moved like a single organism. Guns flashed, brief, ugly glints. The first shot came from the truck's bed, a bright punctuation, and the world detonated into the low, precise terror of combat. Men fell and swore. Cade barked orders that were the old language of survival: flank, cover, move. Rook moved like he'd been made of the road, smooth, relentless. He shoved Nell behind a chest-high stack of tires, then stepped out to be the target she might have been. A bullet hollowed into his shoulder with a scream of heat. He tasted iron and the metallic sharpness of pain. For a second, the world tilted, and he was not the president, but a man with a wound who could still make decisions. He saw Nell move, not the small secretary who stitched patches. Nell as someone who had been taught to bargain and had learned, unsentimentally, how to fight when promises failed.
She slid from her cover with a knife in one hand and a gun in the other, her movements a litany of held breaths and quiet resolves. When she fired, it wasn't theatrical. It was a clean, practiced thing that found a shoulder, then a knee. She did not look back to see if he'd seen her save him. She didn't need to. The world narrowed to the rhythm of their breath. They closed then, the two of them, like a pair of knives finding the same sheath. Cade and the others were the thunder around them. Dario tried to retreat into the safety of his men, but Rook cut the space with a voice that had both authority and something like apology. "This ends." Dario lunged anyway, a cholera of spite and broken promises. And Rook met him with a kind of physical grammar he'd learned in years of rides and fights. When Dario's fist found his jaw, Rook let the pain come, because pain is honest. It leaves tracks. He answered with an elbow, a throw. And when Dario tried to reach for a gun, Nell's blade kissed his ribs and stopped him like a parent slapping a hand away from fire. By the time the yard settled, men on both sides were nursing wounds and pride. Dario lay bruised and furious, a king deposed on the soggy ground, his men slinking back toward their truck. Rook had a red crescent across his shoulder. Nell's face had a thin, angry scratch along the jaw. They both breathed like people who had held their breath for too long, and then, finally, allowed it out. Cade clapped a hand to Rook's shoulder, rough with a kind of relief. "You could have died," he said. The words were accusation and praise braided together. "I almost did," Rook said, and the honesty in his voice made the yard shiver. But she didn't. Nell's eyes found his. There was laughter there, small, unsteady, and a fierce gleam that belonged to women who had been dared and had answered. She stepped closer until their knees touched. "You could have told me to leave," she said, quiet enough that only he could hear. He cupped the bruise at her jaw with fingers that trembled despite themselves. "And miss the chance to claim you?" He let the grin be a simple thing, not the swagger of a president, but the honest tilt of a man who'd chosen something other than control. He leaned down, the motion both mercy and claim, and kissed her. Brief, a promise packed into the space of a second that burned longer than the fight. They pulled apart with their foreheads resting together, an intimate, ridiculous, necessary contact. The men around them were still noisy, still raw with the thrill of violence, but the private thing between the two of them had sealed. A declaration that whatever the club would demand, whatever the ledger required, there was another account now, one kept by two people who'd bled to protect what mattered. When the trucks rolled out, Dario's men muttering threats like rain, the chapter house breathed. Men bandaged wounds, tended bruises, cursed and then laughed with the raw glee of survivors. Rook walked with Nell into the office and closed the door. The room smelled of coffee and the metal of old arguments. "You could have taken it yourself," she said, fingers finding the entrance to his leather jacket. Her hands shook. "You didn't have to." He stopped her with a look that had the weight of a man who had learned to choose. "It wasn't just about me taking it," he said. "It was about showing the men what we would protect. You're worth losing the chair for, Nell. If the club wants to trade me for what they think is pride, then let them. But I won't let them burn you." Her lip quivered. "Are you saying you would step down?" He imagined the room where men argued about him without him in the middle. He pictured the patch on the wall, the ledger on the desk, the smell of smoke and coffee. He thought of a future where power was not a crown, but a shared thing. If it keeps you from being punished for trying to save someone, yes. There was silence like a held breath. It was a sacrifice that tasted of something antique, the relinquishing of throne for the saving of a person who was not an icon, but a human. Nell's mouth opened and closed. She had never asked him for the presidency. She had only ever wanted, improbably, unbearably, the man behind it to be on her side. "No," she said finally, fierce and quick. "You keep it, Rook. I will not take your chair. I will stand in front of you if that is what it takes, but not because I cannot be burned alone, because I choose to stand with you." He thought of the men who would accuse, who would whisper that his softness had killed their law. He thought of Jason's face, of the ledger cleaned and scrubbed and made honest.
He thought of the nights he'd spent carving himself into a man that everyone depended on, and he realized the true act of leadership was not the preservation of a title, but the protection of those it served. "Then we go together," he said. "No more secrets. We rebuild. We show the club what family looks like when it chooses mercy over spectacle." They clasped hands, knuckles white and warm. Nell pressed her forehead to his again, and in that small contact there was the promise of mended things. A man willing to be vulnerable, a woman willing to be seen, a Patch learning that mercy could be its own kind of law. Outside, engines purred as men set to repair, to count, to work. Inside the office, with the ledger between them and the night's rubbled violence behind, Rook and Nell began to stitch a brand new seam, one that would hold because it had been chosen and not enforced. They worked through the morning like people undoing knots, slow hands, patient speech, laughter that came out ragged and a little ashamed. Men scrubbed the safe until it gleamed the way repentance often looks, clean and stubborn. Nell sat at the ledger with Rook beside her, two sets of fingers tracing the same inked line, fingers meeting at decimals and at margins where apologies had.